These cuts are blood money. People will die.
Black Lives Matter is killing Americans.
Republicans want you to die quickly if you get sick.
We could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters.
This president has radicalized so many more people than ISIS ever did.
Things are going swimmingly in Afghanistan.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
All right, welcome to the show. I am Ken, I'm here with Andrew, and this is Reel It In. And our goal is to talk about current events and the news of the day like real, normal, rational human beings. I feel like all of the news and media that I see is tainted by some crazy far right or far left party bias, and I feel like I don't even know what to trust anymore. So what we want to do is sort through the political mess, dive right into the misinformation, and talk through topics how we feel like they should be talked about.
Heck yeah. And a few things before we get started. To say that we're amateur audio editors would be grossly overstating our skill sets, so please bear with us as you might hear some beard scratching, pen tapping, unexplained noises. Who knows? But we're just learning as we go. Also, more importantly, don't stop listening because the things we're saying don't align with the political ideology that you typically hold. If you think we aren't saying interesting or useful stuff, or if you find my voice to be unbearably annoying, that's totally fine. I agree with you, and that's cool. That is a good reason to tune out. But don't get caught in the cycle of tuning things out because you don't agree with us or because your political party says otherwise. Pursue healthy discourse. That's what we really want here. Even if you don't agree, at least we're all attempting to learn together.
All right, so the first topic we chose to discuss, and we might have bitten off more than we can chew,
Definitely.
But here we go, is inflation, which is something that everybody seems to have something to say about right now.
And now us.
And why is that? Because the U.S. experienced inflation of 4.7% in 2021, and year-over-year rates started at about 1.7% in February 2021, steadily climbing to 7.9% in February 2022, and now we're at 8.5% in March 2022. And for context, usual inflation, healthy inflation is what, 2%, 3%?
That's what I'm hearing.
All right. But what does that even mean? Why does it matter? Are politicians being misleading about it? Is the information we're getting even close to accurate? And that's kind of what we want to explore.
Yeah, right. Well, the thing I hear most in regards to inflation is that it's a cost of living increase, right? It usually in reference to an annual pay raise. But inflation is much more than that. It all comes back to currency. Originally, there was no paper cash, right? And inflation was strictly about supply and demand. Historically, it was thought that beginner societies operated on a bartering system, which was popularized by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. But actually, as time unfolds, as we know now, it seems most ancient societies were substituting items infused with value for goods and services, even the most primitive ones, from seemingly very early on. This whole bartering system thing might not quite be as true as we thought.
Have you read The Wealth of Nations?
I own it. And I look good owning it.
It's on your bookshelf.
I haven't opened it yet.
Nice. I haven't read it. I think I've read like excerpts from school, but
someday.
Nice. No, you sounded really, really smart by bringing that in. Right. So all that makes sense. It all kind of got to the point where it didn't really make sense to try and carry around the objects or trade the objects themselves. So they took on something that was supposed to be represent that value. They pick something small that's easier to carry around. You can kind of trade those things instead of the goods and services. And it helps to translate value across items, right? Like, how do I trade? How many pigs does getting my taxes done cost? I have no idea, right? And if it's something like 35 pigs for your tax return, like, what am I going to do with 35 pigs? I'm an accountant, right? Like
transportation costs would be wild.
Right. It makes no sense. So you use this currency to kind of represent that value. I can give you, I think sometimes they used like shells in ancient society. It's a lot easier to carry around. So they trade these things around in order to kind of iron out those different difficulties when it comes to actual bartering. And that's where inflation comes in.
Absolutely. By definition, inflation is a decrease in the purchasing power of money, reflected in a general increase in the price of goods and services in an economy. And in contrast, deflation is the increase in the purchasing power of money, reflected in the general decrease in the price of goods and services. In kind of a weird, horrific irony, consumers tend to pause spending and hoard their money in deflationary periods. Obviously, that just blows out the problem that much more.
Right. There's like this weird like snowball. Like a lot of people talk about when inflation gets out of control, but it's interesting when you go in the opposite direction, right? You're in a bad time in the economy. You don't want to spend your money because you want to make sure that you're financially stable, but that adds to the problem, right? You're experiencing deflation. Everybody puts their money in the banks. You're sucking more money out of the economy, and all of a sudden the economy just kind of grinds to a halt.
Unexpected and terrible, but it does have a gangster name. It's called a liquidity trap.
That's a great band name.
Definitely. It's kind of like a team sport. You got to be a team player. It's not a solo thing.
Just go out there and spend some money for the rest of us.
Exactly.
Awesome. So there's a few concepts that we kind of want to unpack here relative to value. You have intrinsic value, relative value, and representative value. So intrinsic value is when something has worth because it is useful. A house has intrinsic value because you can live in it. It keeps you warm. It has a primary good that it does to you. A car has intrinsic value because it can bring you from one place to another. And then you have comparative value. Some things are worth more than other things based off of how valuable they are to you, right? A
Which
house
is different for everyone, right?
Exactly. But for the most part, like we should agree on some things, right? Like a house should probably be more valuable to you than a hamburger. But, that is the comparative value. Something is worth more than another thing just on face value because what it can do for you. And then you have representative or applied value. And that's where currency comes in, right? So you have a dollar. A dollar is not important at all. It's a piece of paper. It represents value from something else.
We all have to agree that it represents value.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So the interesting thing about that is that representative value is used to kind of iron out the differences in comparative value, right? It's easier to use that as that standard. We know what $5 is worth, right? $5 is worth a Big Mac. Everybody kind of understands $5 is a Big Mac. And if somebody listens to this episode like 100 years from now, they'll be like, oh my gosh, a Big Mac was $5 at one point.
I think you're 100 years ago. I think it's $10 right now.
Is it?
It might be
I
almost...
haven't gotten a Big Mac in a while.
It might be closer to 10 than 5. But that's our point, right?
All right.
Anyway.
Right. Well, and that's inflation, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, something is worth a way different amount than before. So it's interesting, right? Because you have the intrinsic value, something that's worth something because it's worth something. You have the comparative value because things have different values of their own. And then you have this thing that is supposed to kind of take all of those aspects of value and bring it into one paper good. And that makes sense, right? Because then everybody's on the same page. You can take that thing and it represents value to everybody around.
Yeah, absolutely. It like smooths out all our different values. So what causes inflation? What causes that thing that is supposed to represent a standard value to suddenly take on a value of its own that wasn't the same last month, last year, 10 years ago? One driving factor, and potentially the most significant, is when the pool of all currency available in the economy increases. More dollars out there actually means each one of them is worth less.
And right, and that's an interesting concept, right? Because before it was you have just this object, right? Supply, demand, it's like things that you can actually use. Now there's suddenly this other dynamic at play. It's the supply and demand of the currency on top of that. So like you can have inflation because of the object, like that thing, like the hamburger costs more money, right? Because you have, higher labor dollars. But then now you have this added layer of now you have a currency supply and demand that you have to deal with. And the cost might increase even though everything about that object is completely the same as before. Now it costs more money.
It shouldn't matter. It
makes no tangible sense because it's not a tangible thing. It's like a random economic concept, but it has a real life impact.
It impacts everybody. And I think that's everyone's problem because we all think, why shouldn't my wage stay the same and the loaf of bread stay the same? And then that's the end of it. Like, if only it was that easy, right? So that is driven by fiscal policy or government spending, and separately, monetary policy, which is controlled by the Federal Reserve. Two separate things we kind of conflate, I think, when we speak about it.
And that can honestly probably be an episode all on its own. It's so complex and there's so many different variables. But for the purposes of this discussion for inflation, as interest rates are high, people are more inclined to buy treasury bills, and then the Fed tweaks those prices to make it like more incentivized for people to buy them. And if people are buying treasury bills, it's pulling money out of the circulation in the economy. So that's reducing the supply of money, which means that your dollar is going to be stronger. Whereas in the opposite, if you have expansionary policy where you're trying to get more money out there, you start to make those treasury bills a little bit more expensive, or you lower the interest rate, so it's less attractive for somebody to invest in it, right?
Who's you there? The Fed? Is that where you're?
Yes, this is the monetary policy through the Fed, right? So they're basically trying to suck money out of the economy by treasury bills. Another critical factor is supply and demand of goods, right? This is the traditional, if demand goes up, your prices go up, or if supply goes down, your prices go up. With inflation, that's referred to either as cost push or demand pull inflation, which I don't even like the term cost push.
Misleading.
But then you also have inflation now, where we're talking about the supply and demand of money. So you're not even talking about the goods themselves. It's the supply and demand of money will increase the cost or decrease the cost of goods all on its own. Separate thing.
Not fair at all. Yeah, and one thing to clarify, inflation isn't always a bad thing. Surprisingly, it can be good. The possibility for inflation should always exist with a currency. And this allows for, control and balance of that currency.
Yeah, right. We had said that like a healthy inflation is like 2 or 3%. It kind of allows you to kind of tweak that monetary or fiscal policy to, like, if you need the economy to heat up a little bit, you do some expansionary policy, you get some money, flowing out there, and it can kickstart your economy. You never want to get too far in one direction or another.
Right.
You want to kind of get in that sweet spot, because that allows you to, make a move if you need to, pull a lever, to make a change. If you're experiencing an economy that's growing too fast, that you need to kind of reel in so that you have multiple years of growth, you can have contractionary policy, and now all of a sudden, you're using inflation to your personal benefit for the economy,
which is terrible. Like when the times are so good, they have to damper it.
But there can be times where you're not dampening the economy when it's heated up, and that can actually be a really bad thing.
More to come
on that. So there's a few different terms that we talk about when it comes to inflation. One of them is transitory inflation, which basically just means temporary inflation. So that's not something that's going to last a few years. Typically, it corrects itself within a year or so. And I think a perfect example of that is lumber during COVID, right? Supply was down because, they were shutting down the factories that were producing the lumber. So there was that labor shortage that was driving up prices. Everybody's home and they have nowhere to spend money. Nobody's going on vacation. So they're like, hey, I have all this money that I usually spend on vacation. What am I going to do with it? I'm going to do home projects, right? Let's get Chip and Joanna Gaines on the channel, figure out some things we want to do, right? We're doing home projects. So now we have this supply problem with the lumber, but then we also have this demand problem where there's a higher demand, right? And then on top of it, the government's like, what do we want to do right now? Let's send stimulus checks to everybody, right? So now they're flooding the economy with even more money. And so now everybody's like, hey, I want to use this money on home projects because I have nothing else to do with it, right? So it's like this perfect storm where the White House, the Federal Reserve, everything was like coming together to do all of the things that is wrong with inflation, right?
All of the wrong things, yes.
And all of those indicators were that it was transitory, right? And the White House and the Federal Reserve are kind of indicating that the current inflation now in 2021 and 2022 is transitory. The markets right now are suggesting that that in 2020, absolutely, that was transitory inflation. Lumber prices have already dropped a little bit, not all the way back down. But this lingering inflation that's happening in 2022, it's suggesting otherwise, right? They're saying that that's probably going to stay with us.
And lingering makes it sound like a cute little kitty, but it's actually a monster. It doesn't seem like a petering, lingering thing. Also, we loved those stimmy checks, so I don't know. We were all kind of to blame, I think.
Home Depot loved me. So.
Right, true. So I pulled this article from Forbes. This guy, Adam Strauss from Pekin Hardy Strauss Wealth Management, wrote this in July of 2021, but it's still hyper relevant now. He just had basically 6 points as to why we're seeing this inflation situation as more than transitory. Excessive levels of debt, government debt, corporate debt, consumer debt. What we spoke about earlier, record fiscal deficit spending combined with record monetary stimulus. The next is deglobalization. That's a little bit more meta and vague, but
right, and that's kind of that nationalism, trying to pull everything back into your, current, focusing on your current country as opposed to linking into the global supply chain.
And there's pros and cons for both.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next one is rising energy prices. We're definitely continually seeing that over the months. Increasing wages.
$15 an hour, right?
plus a hiring bonus.
I feel like that's a little excessive. Let's,
I took a picture of a Taco Bell in North Carolina last week, and it said like I think it was $19 or $20 an hour with hiring bonus.
I think the coolest part about that is that you felt the need to take a picture of it.
Well, yeah. Well, we're doing this, so we're those kinds of people, right?
I get it.
Yeah. Quick anecdote about that. Baby boomers are retiring in droves, with less population filling in those roles. According to Oxford Economics, an estimated 2 million workers have retired since the beginning of the pandemic. Compared to the previous year in 2019, that's double.
Yeah, and I think they're referring to this as the Great Resignation. Like it's hard to find people to work right now because everybody is just like, peace out.
They've coined this era.
Yeah, they call it the Great Resignation.
Terrifying. The final indicator is just the depreciation of the dollar. So put all that together, and a lot of smarter people than us are saying that this inflation is here to stay.
Yeah, and so then there's this other term, right? Stagflation. So when inflation occurs, typically you'll see a growth in the GDP as well. Stagflation is when you have that inflation, but the GDP is actually dropping; it's shrinking, and that's particularly bad, right?
Seems a lot worse,
right? You need that positive economic growth. It needs to be those two things need to reflect each other. We said 2 to 3%. But what happens here with stagflation, you have depressed economic growth, there's economic hardship, and, some might question, are we seeing this now, right? We saw in 2020, we had steadily rising inflation and GDP dropped 3.5%. But that was really because of COVID restrictions, right? We had high unemployment. Everybody kind of had to stay home, rising
predictable
prices,
drop.
Right? Understandable. But then it rebounded 5.7% in 2021, right? So you wouldn't consider that to be stagflation. It was kind of transitory stagflation, right? But it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2022. And actually, the numbers just came out for Q1 2022 for the GDP, and the economy shrank 1.4%. And I think they were expecting it to grow 5 or 6%.
So this stagflation situation seems to be continuing on for now, at least.
It might be, right? But so this brings up a great example, something that I found absolutely hilarious, and is kind of like the whole point of this podcast, right? So the numbers drop for Q1 2022 for the GDP, right? And I go on the Fox News website. Big, bold, red letters right in the center of the page. And it says, Biden's tanking recovery. Economy hits worst quarter in 2 years as record high inflation and labor shortages weigh on growth. Right?
Break out your pitchforks.
Right? First, you see Biden's name is the first thing on there, right? They're trying to kind of tag his name to it. They use the phrase record high, which is an enormous pet peeve of mine, because as we will see, if it's not a record, don't call it a record. Okay.
Right.
So that's, just kind of gets under my skin a little bit. And then they're using the phrase worst quarter in 2 years. 2 years, there's only 8 quarters, right? Like that's a little bit laughable. Come on.
Yeah.
But then, right. So then I shift over to CNN's website, ghost town, right? Like we're talking tumbleweeds. It's nowhere.
No problem at all.
Right. And so, finally I'm searching. Off in the corner, there's this like tiny little text box, and it says, U.S. economy unexpectedly shrank in the first quarter. And I actually laughed out loud. It's almost like they were like, oh, whoops. What do you know? The economy shrank. It's so curious. Like, what an unexpected turn of events, completely unrelated to anything else that's going on.
Can't take any responsibility for it.
Right?
We didn't see that coming.
So like, whoopsie. Right. So then I go to MSNBC, which I would have thought that CNN would probably have been like the most left on this. It's nowhere on the entire website, right? I have to scroll down 3 pages, and finally I find an article. It's 3 paragraphs long, and it talks more about increased consumer spending than it talks about the GDP numbers, right? So we're seeing 2 polar opposite reactions to these numbers, and it's like, how do you know which of these 2 things is accurate, right? One is saying the economy is on fire, and then the other one is it's a complete non-story. Like, you might as well not even pay attention to it. Like, what is even the truth here?
And it makes people like us just kind of read this for fun now, as opposed to actually gaining information, because it's all so wildly opposing that like, there must not be any truth to it. So it's just like you're reading it for the sport of it at that point. All right, so let's get back to stagflation. The last time there was lasting stagflation was in the late 1970s, when Nixon tried to combat inflation by instituting wage and price controls on the U.S.
And that's like probably the worst tool that you can use to try and fight inflation.
Right. You're treating the symptom and not the cause. And then during that time, oil prices surged because OPEC tightened supply.
Right. So the root causes of stagflation, it's typically you've got a fiscal or monetary policy combined with a sudden supply shock, right? So, I said wage and price controls don't work, but to be fair, you can use that as a tool, but typically it's not very effective. It only lasts a few months. And then you're right back to where you started. So really the way that you fight it is, you make monetary and fiscal policy decisions that match the economic reality. You have to cut, reprioritize spending, try to address supply shocks.
I think sadly, a lot of those methods too are just more exhaustive, more expensive, and require more effort.
Well, and they're just not popular either. Right?
Sure, that's true.
And everybody just seems to be trying to get elected in the next election cycle, right? So they're not going to make those decisions. And how do we measure inflation, right? We have a consumer price index, which is a price of a basket of goods at standard costs across different sections of the economy, right? So you've got like goods, services, housing, healthcare, and they use that to compare month over month. So they choose the same things. They literally, they'll go into a store with a clipboard and look at like how much does a loaf of bread cost? Check. Eggs, check. And then they'll go into, automobile store. I sound like I'm 150. You go into an auto shop, right? And a car, a tire costs, $100. Check, and they make this cross section of what these prices are, and they use the same items year over year and see how those prices change.
Seems like a good method.
Yeah.
And how else can you do it?
Yeah. And so then you also have something that's called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. That's a mouthful. The PCE. Same thing. They do the same process, but they just make the categories weighted slightly differently. Like I think housing and healthcare are higher. No, healthcare is higher in it, but housing is lower.
And going back to the very beginning when you were talking about the different percentages of inflation, that these two methodologies, that's where those numbers are coming from.
Exactly. Yep. You're using typically it's the CPI, and if they're saying 2% increase in goods, it's this basket of goods that they are recording the prices for on average based on those weights increased by 2%.
So here's another fun bit. There's also this thing called the Misery Index.
Sounds fun.
Right? Another metal band name. It's intended to measure the degree of economic stress that people are feeling. So it's calculated by adding the unemployment rate to the inflation rate. I guess anything over 10% is considered rather bad. And where we're at it's about 4% for unemployment and 8% for inflation. Doesn't look great.
Yeah, I'd say unemployment is probably another good episode for a topic all on its own, right? So we won't get into that. But, kind of in summary, the misery index is getting pretty high.
An interesting impact in a positive light, though, is that if you took money out in a loan before inflation, that loan becomes actually easier to pay off. You take a loan out and then the dollar amount stays the same. But if your wages are going up with inflation, that loan becomes a bit easier to pay off because you're making more money.
Which this is not a advocacy for you to go and just take out a bunch of money right now.
We are giving real financial advice, unsolicited.
So whenever we're talking about economic concepts, we're always going to circle back to the fact that nothing really happens in a vacuum in the economy. It's like a domino effect where everything impacts everything. Everything is so interconnected, and you can't really just talk about one singular impact. You have to acknowledge the fact that the rest of the dominoes exist. And these dominoes you could consider to be economic indicators, which is essentially something that tells us something about the economy. We can look at this indicator and understand something about how the economy is functioning. And inflation is one of those indicators. And of these indicators, there's essentially two buckets. There's leading indicators and there's lagging indicators. A leading indicator is something that happens first. It happens all of its own, and it tells you something about the economy. An example of this is a new housing build. So people have a positive outlook on the economy. They kind of trust the fact that there is going to be continued growth, and so they're more likely to build a house. That's one of the things that's considered to be a leading indicator. A lagging indicator is something that happens after some of those primary indicators have happened. It happens because something else already happened. So inflation is pretty much the definition of a lagging indicator, and it's the result of other policies that already happened. And that doesn't mean because it's a lagging indicator, it doesn't mean that it's slow to develop. It can happen very quickly. It's just that it's the effect part of cause and effect. It's the thing that happens afterwards. It's not causing something else to happen.
Yeah, and it's not a direct line, a story leading to lagging. This is a loop that continually evolves, and when prices go up, wages have to follow that. Otherwise, no one's buying anything, and things fall apart. So it's definitely a loop, and if you don't have to intervene, if things are trucking along at a responsible rate, 2% or whatever it is, there doesn't have to be dramatic expansionary or contractionary monetary or fiscal policy. Things are predictable, and prices and wages can kind of be in tandem with each other. So we've got a good handle on what inflation is and how it works, I hope at this point. So let's look back. I like looking at the history of topics like this. The U.S. really started tracking this in 1919 with the creation of the Consumer Price Index we talked about earlier, CPI. Who knows how reliable this is, but there's estimated data from 1776 all the way to 1913. But it's obviously less precise, less reliable. The metrics were probably all over the place as to the data they collected. But, so check this out, using the less precise data, in 1778, I guess inflation in the U.S. was roughly 29.78.
So that was before the dollar even existed, right? I think they used like a paper note at
Shells.
that time.
It was shells.
Definitely not shells. Yeah, no, that was something that I found interesting, was like the currencies that they used prior to the dollar being in existence. And I also got a good chuckle thinking about like what the goods on the CPI would be in 1776.
Oh, sure.
Like,
yeah.
Like, was it goat milk and like,
Oh man, no, I'm not ready for
wagon,
this. But...
wagon wheels as opposed to tires? I don't know.
Right. Maybe it was still similar things like lumber and building materials. And
I guess that's true.
That's probably been sort of consistent.
Did they have coffee back then? Was that a thing?
They've had coffee since they've had mankind. I think that's
I
early
guess that's
on.
Good.
So sure, yeah. Then moving a little bit forward, the highest inflation we've seen since the formal dollar has been around was 1917. World War I, inflation of 19.66%, which is almost triple what we're experiencing now, to put it into context. And then in the 1940s, World War II, we saw a peak inflation of 18.1%, also very depressing. 1974, moving up a few decades, 12.3%, not as terrifying, but that was around the end of the gold standard. So I can't imagine what life must have been like at that point for everyone.
Well, and also, like, you start to kind of notice a pattern here. Like, inflation peaks in World War I. Long lull of no inflation. Inflation peaks during World War II. Long lull. And then we make this egregious economic decision. Well, I won't call it egregious. We make this significant economic decision to no longer follow the gold standard, and inflation kicks in there as well. So inflation doesn't typically happen when things are just kind of like chugging along and there are no significant events occurring. Inflation happens when there's this monumental impact that's happening on the economy. And that's what we see kind of over and over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. Then following the gold standard debacle for the next few years, 1978 to 1981, I guess the Fed was maintaining expansionary monetary policy when it probably should have been contracting. So there was a peak of 13.3%.
And that's pretty significant because a lot of times people will point their fingers at one particular indicator over another. They'll be like, government spending, that's the thing that's causing inflation. That's the only thing that causes inflation. But it's not, right? Because in this case, it wasn't necessarily the government spending that was causing it. It was very clearly that monetary policy decision was made to continue expansionary monetary policy when they probably should have been drawing that back.
I can only imagine what newspapers would be saying during these traumatic upheavals, during big inflation, about the left or the right being the root cause, the problem of it.
I'd love to go back and see some of those news articles because for the most part, we have this like idealized view of how things were back then. And everybody was just kind of, buttoned up and people were pretty civil with one another. But like I've heard anecdotally that people were like savages like to each other. They absolutely brutalized each other with insults, like called each other like bastards and like
in the newspapers.
Right. There was like newspaper articles like just completely eviscerating people with insults. So I am genuinely curious whether any of those have been specifically tied to inflation before.
True. Maybe. Absolutely. It has to do with money, and that's when people get most aggressive, I would say.
And also, you would think that people would kind of learn from their mistakes, like looking at past history, like especially when you have a very specific case where something happened in U.S. history that led to a negative outcome. You would think we'd be able to look back at that and say, hey, let's not repeat the same mistake.
I feel like we could go on a real tangent about all the lessons we haven't learned when things go wrong.
So since the creation of the CPI, we really only had one sustained period of deflation, and it was from 1930 to 1933. Everybody is kind of familiar with that time frame, right? It was the Great Depression.
Everyone's grandparents, I would say.
Terrible time, right? This is not something that we aspire to, right? So that's not to say that deflation is always bad, but the only time in U.S. history that we've had more than 2 years of deflation has been 1930 to 1933.
It's incredible.
Blame it on Herbert Hoover.
Thanks.
One great quote that I did come across relative to inflation was after the whole end of the gold standard and experiencing the inflation there, the economist Herbert Stein, who was a top advisor to Richard Nixon, called inflation, quote, a hydra-headed monster that comes in various forms, sometimes led by wages, sometimes by prices, by foods, by oil. Sometimes it was domestic, sometimes imported. And any attempt to tame prices resulted in more inflation, just like the mythological monster, growing two heads each time one was cut off.
What a visual.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the key here is like it's so easy to cause inflation and so hard to reduce. We talked about the feedback effect, and there's actually a name for it. It's called hyperinflation, and basically that just means accelerated inflation. And the definition is usually 50% per month, but some people will say we'll do it by year, and they'll say 600 to 1,000%. There's no like absolutely definitive definition of it, but basically it just means really quickly getting hit with inflation.
The first time we see that hyperinflation, it came during the French Revolution at the end of the 1700s, where monthly inflation peaked at 143%.
And take into context, right, the inflation we're experiencing right now, 8% year over year. This is 143% month over month, right? That's nuts.
Dwarfs what we're dealing with completely. And we don't see this hyperinflation situation happen again until the 20th century. After World War II, it's, all those European countries that expended everything they had for this war had to pay everything back.
And essentially it's just they printed money that they didn't have, and that's really what kind of caused it.
Yeah.
And the most recent example of hyperinflation was Venezuela in 2016. We thought, 143% month over month was bad. Venezuela, prices shifted by 800% year over year.
800%
in 2016. Then 80,000% in 2018.
80,000%.
And now up to 380,000% year over year.
Yep.
Right? We're wringing our hands over 8%. It's 380,000%. Essentially, a $2 cup of coffee in 2018 would cost $7,600 in 2019. That's absolutely nuts.
I would say you'd have to kick that habit at that point.
Well, it ended up being, the currency was worth so little. The Venezuelan bolivar, I believe it's called.
Sounds right.
It was actually more cost effective to use their currency as toilet paper than buying the toilet paper itself.
Imagine that.
Right. So let's do the math. Like let's say you're springing for the extra large 1,000 sheet per roll toilet paper. And let's go with 2-ply toilet paper, right? So that's 2,000 sheets. So effectively it would be 2,000 bills that you're using. If your toilet paper costs $7,600, then why not just use it to do the deed,
I mean, you make a great point, honestly.
And while we're on the topic, if you take away one thing from this podcast, 2-ply toilet paper is worth it. I grew up on single ply, and let me tell you, there's nothing like 2-ply toilet paper.
I didn't realize in episode 1 we would have a fundamental disagreement. I didn't realize we'd be here.
Are you telling me that you're a single-ply toilet paper man?
I started off as a 2-ply guy, and I've downsized. Yeah, that took a lot of mental gymnastics to get to that point, but I don't buy it. And I'm not thinking sheer creature comforts of my person. I'm thinking about the rest of the world, my plumbing, and the fact that you could use a little bit longer of a sheet than you normally would to get that similar effect.
So
I don't know, man.
So I completely disagree. First, because you have a septic system that breaks down the toilet paper completely. It literally disappears and feeds your lawn.
Well, half as slowly if you have double ply, right?
Well, I wouldn't expect so because, you're using twice as much.
I don't know. I guess that we'll have to agree to disagree
Agree
here.
to disagree. But basically,
I don't think we'll recover from this.
In the shortages of COVID, when everybody was rushing out to buy toilet paper, instead they should have been trying to seek out a bowl of ours because they were plentiful at the time.
And maybe if you started a company where you could double ply bolivars, you'd be all set.
Perfect. So how did this hyperinflation take root? Basically, their economy was roaring. They're an oil-based economy. And while they were in the good times, they decided to roll out a bunch of social programs. So they had this enormous infrastructure of social programs there was, entitlement payments, things like that. And then the price of oil kind of tanked in the 2016, 2018, up until now.
That was almost all of their exports, I think.
Right. That was essentially their entire economy was propped up on that. And so when their economy took that huge hit, rather than saying like, we can't support this infrastructure anymore, they just started to print more money in order to support it. And, remember that a big part of inflation is fiscal responsibility. And you kind of have to keep in mind, money only has value because people trust it. It actually got to the point where they tried to reintroduce a new currency with 6 fewer decimal points on it. Right?
Whoa.
It was like the Bolivar 2.0. But because people had already lost faith in the previous currency, they just continued to price things out in dollars and they just kind of ignored the Bolivar altogether.
And bringing it back home to us, the U.S. has not yet been a victim of hyperinflation, but we came close, I guess, 2 times during the Revolutionary and the Civil Wars.
It sounds like the moral of the story is if you want to avoid inflation, just don't go to war with people.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? I wish we could pull that off.
It's just a logical, let's just make that happen.
War's too great, apparently, because we just keep doing it. I don't know.
All right, so we've got some really good stuff, but let's get into what people are saying about inflation. One interesting trend that I noticed while kind of looking through the different articles is that whenever the news was talking about the impact of inflation, they always seem to reference that it's a threat to the Democrats in the upcoming elections. It's tied, even in the headline, it'll say, inflation is up. I wonder what this means for the Democrats. But it was across the board, CNN, Fox, NPR, MSNBC, ABC, they're all focusing on this. And my question is I'm sitting here, why is that what we're focusing on? Why are we focusing on, I wonder what this is going to do for the Democrats or the Republicans for the midterms? Shouldn't we be focusing on the fact that this is a problem for the Americans?
For all of us? Yeah.
For the people that are living it? I don't think we care about an election. I think we care about the fact that we need to get inflation in control.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know why we care about that. It's part of the show of watching the fight between the two sides. It doesn't make any sense. It's not any self-interest on our parts that we care about that.
And that actually brings us to our first quote and I actually didn't know very much about Senator Joe Manchin before this, but I certainly know a lot about him now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so let's listen to the first quote that Joe Manchin had regarding inflation right now.
How do you think the inflation will affect Democrats in the midterms?
I don't know on the political. People should quit worrying about the politics. The worst thing can happen is you lose. Do the right thing for the American people. Be an American. Don't worry about being a Democrat or Republican. Be an American. Do our jobs that we swore an oath to. That's it.
There we go. That's exactly it, right?
We should have him on Reel It In because I feel like that's exactly what we were just saying.
Maybe we change our profile picture to, or whatever. I don't even know. I feel like such a dad when I say that. Change our profile picture.
From the MySpace days.
Yeah.
No, that resonates. That's kind of what we're saying. We're focusing on all the wrong things. It should be about what we're all dealing with, the people that are dealing with inflation.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's specifically the fact of focusing on elections and midterms. That's what the reporter is interested in asking about, right? Is that reflective of what Americans want to know? So is the reporter even asking the right question? Why is the reporter asking that question, right? I don't think many people care about that. I think people care way more about whether or not inflation is going to be going down anytime soon and what we need to be doing in order to combat that.
Yeah, I think most of the questions coming from reporters to, the current administration or senators, or they're either on the same team trying to throw softballs to make them look good as for their answer, or trying to screw them up in regards to future elections. So it's like this internal struggle that has nothing to do with the rest of us. They're just either trying to make each other look good or look bad.
All right, so turns out we had a lot more to say about inflation than we initially thought. So I think it makes sense to break this one into a 2-part episode. So we're going to stop here, and then next time we'll talk through what everybody else has to say about inflation and have some fun dissecting that piece of it. So in the meantime, feel free to let us know what you thought. Leave us a review wherever it is that you get your podcasts, and you can also find us on Twitter at ReelItInPodcast or via email at thereelitInpodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought, and let us know what topics you'd like us to talk about in the future once we finish up with inflation. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you during part 2 of this episode of Reel It In.